And hopefully everybody is seeing that first slide come up. So the first thing I wanted to do was just kind of give a recap. For folks who were here last time, we had an introduction to the emissions modeling framework. We talked a little bit about what the software is, how it works. We went over broadly the different functions that it can handle, and then we started looking at the different types of data that the emissions modeling framework can help you manage. Now, for those of you who are able to connect, hopefully you had a chance to try out the little homework exercises. And basically there we were walking through getting connected, exploring some data sets, learning a little bit more about the EMF interface. And so just briefly, I'm going to switch over to the EMF itself, which hopefully is up on the screen now. First, I wanted to mention that I can see a lot of accounts got created and a lot of people have been logging in, and so that is fantastic. And also we've had several people logged in simultaneously, which is also great because we wanted to see how that was going to work out. So that is fantastic. So then this is just my EMF client connected to the Marama Live server, in fact. And so in your homework, you were playing around with the Dataset Manager window a little bit. The homework guided you through learning how to sort by different columns. Also, you used the filter option to be able to narrow down the rows that you see. In today's webinar and in the homework coming after, we're going to do some more discussion about how you find data sets, because that's obviously a key thing, is finding the data sets that you need. You are also able to look at some of the properties of a data set. So I have the oil and gas data set selected here, and I'd opened up the properties window on that. And so you got a quick overview of some of these properties, and in today's webinar we're going to talk in more detail about what those properties are. You also had a chance to go in and look at the raw data of a data set. So that was from this Data tab, and I have the window open. And so this was how you could see the actual raw data that's imported into the EMF database. And I think the rest of the homework just had some more exercises. You got to see maybe the projects, how the Marama data is organized. And like I said, today we're going to go into more detail about those different aspects of data sets and how we find data sets and start working with them. So if you do have any questions about the homework, feel free to put them in the chat and we can go over them if there's anything that was confusing. But for now, we'll go back to the slides. And as I mentioned today, we'll be discussing the data sets in detail, including the different properties, the data itself, versioning of data sets, and then also how do we export data sets to a file on disk.
Excuse me, Catherine?
Yes.
We did have a question come in, and it was about the data viewer. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, the question was, in the exercise using the data viewer window, could we have searched for golf somehow?
Ah, that is a very good question. I believe yes, because I think you could use the row filter options, which you will actually get experience with in today's homework. The row filter lets you do basically SQL type queries, where clauses. So the row filter would let you say, so in this window that I have up right now, if I was interested in finding things with a particular SCC, my row filter might look something like SCC equals the particular thing that I'm interested in. And so in the exercise, yes, I think you could have written a row filter where you asked for the surrogate description that contained the word golf. But you can certainly try that after you do the homework coming out from today. You'll get some examples of this row filter. So that would be a great thing to try, is go back and find that exercise and try finding the thing using the filtering.
Okay, great.
Okay, So you've already seen how we view the properties of a data set, which is we use the data set manager, and we can use the select column to select data sets that we're interested in. And then there's buttons at the bottom of the window, and we can either click view or edit to view or edit the properties. And when you first go in there, we're going to see the summary tab. So I'm going to have a screenshot of that on the next page. So this is a screenshot of the dataset properties view, and we've got several tabs of different types of information, and we're going to go over each of those. But the summary tab is designed to give you sort of an overview of the data, and it shows you a lot of the metadata about each data set. So we talked about how we import files into the EMF, and then we have the raw data in there. But a data set is much more than the raw data itself. We store a lot of metadata about the data sets, and that metadata is really what can be helpful for organizing files, for keeping track of changes to files, for just generally summarizing information about the files to make it easier to find. So if we take a look at this summary window, I just want to go over some of the different fields here. So every data set has a name, and the name is guaranteed by the EMF to be unique. So when data sets are imported, they get a name, but the name can also be edited at any time. In most cases, the name is based on the file name, because a lot of times you already have a naming system that you've been using for files, and so it makes sense to keep that same naming system for your data sets. But the EMF will guarantee that every single one of those is unique. Every data set also has a description. And when the files are first imported, anything that's the header of the data files, which is usually things that start with a £, those automatically get put into the description field. You can also edit the description field to have more information in it. There's one little caveat there. When you export files, anything that you put in the description will get put into the file itself, which then if you're going to use the files in other programs, like if you were going to do modeling runs with it, you need to make sure you don't put anything in the description that would confuse the format for the actual modeling run to be done. You also saw in the homework that the Marama files are organized by project, and the project is something that is assigned when the data set gets imported. It can also be changed, and EMF administrators also have the ability to add new projects. So this is a great way to keep files organized and to be able to group all the files for a particular project together. The data set also maintains who originally created the data set, and of course the data set type. We talked about how the data set type it determines the format of the data itself. It's used when the data is imported and then also when the data is exported. And so the data set type is really fundamental to the data set itself. There's various pieces of information like the time period and the temporal resolution. These are pieces of information that try to describe the file so that it's easier to find, so that you can have a quick view of sort of what is this file that I'm looking at. A lot of that pieces of information that are down in this quadrant here, during import, oops, sorry about that, I hit the wrong button. There we go. During import, the EMF tries to figure out the best values for those options based on the file itself. It doesn't always get it right. In fact, this example screenshot that I have, I noticed is wrong, because this screenshot is actually from an inventory that's just July average day emissions values. But the importer, since it just sees that it's an ORL non-road inventory, it did its best, but it thinks that it covers the entire year. So this is something where after import, you could go in and fix up those values to match exactly what your data set is. The EMF tries to be smart, but it can't handle every case because sometimes the files they aren't self-describing like that. It can't figure all of that out.
Excuse me, I have a question. Catherine, where do you see that the system thinks that it's all year?
Oh, yeah, that is, are you seeing the screenshot of the summary tab?
Uh-huh.
Down here in this lower left-hand quadrant,
Mhm.
Well, the temporal resolution is annual, but then it has a time period start and a time period end. And
Oh,
so
okay.
it pulled from the description of the file that the year is 2005, and so it set the time period start and end to the full year, starting on January 1st, ending on December 31st. I happen to know that this is actually just July data, because the
Okay.
description tells me that.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Then some other information that we store about the data sets. Every data set has a status, and basically this status just tells you if the data originally was imported from a file on disk or if it came from some other processing step. So when we get into the cost stuff, when you do control strategy analysis, that portion of the EMF can automatically create data sets. And so the status will be something like created by cost instead of imported. We also keep track of the last modified date, which is the last time the data was modified. In this case, that last modified date came from the file modification date when the thing was imported. This file was only imported into the EMF in December. That's what the creation date tells me. So the modification date actually came from the last modified date on the file. The last access date tells you when this file was last exported for a modeling run. We will talk about that when we get to the History tab in just one second. I do want to mention the intended use option. So this intended use is a pull-down menu. It's got options like public versus private. What this is it's a setting for you to know sort of what the intended use of this data set is. It's not something that the EMF enforces, but it is a good way to be able to tell other people, oh, this is a file, this is a data set I'm working on. It's private right now, but once it's ready, we'll change it to public. We had a question last week about how are the data sets managed between different groups. And the EMF, it's not restricting your access to data sets, but you could use this intended use field to set sort of, oh, this is a file that we intend to be used by this group versus public for everybody. That list, it's a pull-down menu. It can be modified, but it needs to be modified in the EMF database itself by a system administrator. So this would be something where maybe if you decide on a set of uses that make sense, then that could be updated, and then you'd be able to tag different data sets with their intended use. And the final, sure.
Sorry. Just a quick question. Does changing properties for the file count as a modification, and then you would have a change to the last modified date?
Yeah, according to what I've seen, no. The last modified date only takes into account modifications to the data itself, not the metadata, not these properties.
Thank you.
And then the last field here is default version. We're going to be talking about versions of the data set in just a second, but basically you can have versions of data sets in terms of when the data has been changed, and then you can set which version is default. So as a new version gets created, once it's ready to go, that can now be the default version. And default version will be used when you go to export data or do analysis with it. You'll need to tell the EMF which version of the data you want to use, and so default version will just indicate which one should be used by default. Okay, so just a quick poll, and I think Julie will put the poll up as a using software. Okay.
Okay, which of these properties is not stored for data sets? So go ahead and make your choice. Okay, we're coming around 80% voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and then share it. So back to you, Catherine.
Okay, so the answer we were looking for was spatial resolution. I talked about how we do store that the date that the data set was created. That's the time that it was imported from disk. We also store which user created the data set, which user actually did the import. I kind of glossed over a little bit, I realized, some of these options. So temporal resolution, that's something like whether it's annual versus monthly or daily, and that is an option that the EMF stores. So then we get to spatial resolution versus geographic region. And if we go back, Julie, if you want to share my screen again, I'll go back to the summary tab. Okay. So there's this big quadrant of information down here in the lower left. We have both a region and the country. So geographic region is a property that's stored. What is not stored is a spatial resolution, which would be like, oh, is this gridded, or what's the granularity of the data? We don't really have that kind of thing. This is an annual inventory, so this would be county level data, presumably, but the EMF does not specifically store what's the granularity of the spatial information. Okay, so one little diversion I want to talk about is the distinction between viewing an item and editing an item, because this will come up as you work through the system. So viewing the item means that you're looking at the data set, but you can't change any of its information, whereas editing it means that you can change information. And you'll tell the difference because when you view something, you won't have pull-down menus, you won't have text boxes that you can type in, whereas when you're editing, you can actually change things. And the reason that this is important is that this is a multi-user system, and so multiple people can be logged on at the same time. And so we want to avoid any conflicts if multiple people try to edit a data set at the same time. So the way the system is set up, you can have one person gets a lock to edit the data set, and while they have it locked for editing, nobody else will be able to edit it, but other people can view it. And in fact, last time we had a question about if somebody is editing a data set, can other people export it? And in my testing, yes, I was able to open a data set for editing, and then as a different user, I was able to do the export. I also found out that there's actually two different locks. So one person can be editing the properties of a data set while somebody else edits the data itself. I'm not sure how often something like that would come up.
Hey, Catherine, we had a quick question here about file descriptions such as smoke, and this was from Andy Bodnarek. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, so maybe Andy could, I unmuted you, Andy, perhaps you could describe that further.
Yeah, you were saying that the spatial wasn't stored, but what about the, or spatial resolution was not stored? What about the file description? So if the file is smoke, wouldn't that tell you a little bit about spatial resolution?
Oh, like in terms of the description up at the top of the file, right, or something?
Yeah, like where it says flat file 10. Some of it will say like smoke or what if you look at the file names.
Mm-hmm. Right, right, yeah. There is sort of, I guess I was making a little bit of a distinction between sort of the explicitly broken out metadata fields of a file versus just overall. Yes, you're correct that the EMF will try to store as much as you can give it in terms of, you know, descriptions and names and everything. So yeah, if your description or name has the spatial resolution in it, then obviously it'll be there. The EMF does not sort of specifically understand the nuances of spatial resolution the way that it does with like temporal resolution or the time period covered.
Yeah, so if you had a modeling file that said 4K grid or something, then you would know.
Yeah, now if you had a modeling file, you would not have a property to be able to tell the EMF, oh yeah, by the way, this is 4K grid cells instead of 36. Well, you'd know based on description.
Yeah, if you had it in the file name, you would know.
Right. Yep. Yep.
So it could store it that way.
But Andy, let me just make sure Catherine says if this is right or wrong, but in terms of how EMF is able to stitch together inventories, it can handle stitching together things temporally, but spatially it doesn't have that capability. Would that be right in terms of distinction there?
Yeah, basically the EMF has some features where it can do some slicing and dicing by time period. It doesn't have anything really getting into any of that spatial level stuff.
I think you'll see
So
this a
maybe
little
the
bit
question,
later, Andy.
And especially the inventory data that the Catherine is using as an example, it can be used for any different modeling domain, which means it could be used for 36 by 36, 12K, 4K. So inventory data doesn't really tie to the gridding, like how big is the gridding grid size is. So it doesn't really matter. So inventory data itself doesn't normally hold that kind of grid information in the file.
Would the smoke files hold it?
Even if a smoke is using it, but inventory data itself is not really associated. You can use those count inventory data into little grid cell, as smoke will do that, but that's kind of separate step. But inventory data itself can be used for any different types of, any various size of the modeling domain can be used for.
I think we're going to have to move on, but I think that the point is made, and we probably should move on. Go ahead, Catherine.
okay. Let's see, so we were just discussing editing. The reason I wanted to bring this up also is that you must be editing a data set in order to do things like create notes associated with the data set or work with QA steps. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're searching for an option that you're not seeing, you may want to double check if you are viewing it or editing it. In general, I would recommend that you stay viewing things as much as possible, just so that in case somebody else needs to get in there and do something there, that you're not blocking them. You will have an exercise as part of the homework where you will need to add a note to a data set, so you will be editing it at that point. And so if everybody's trying to do their homework at the same time, you may need to just be a little bit patient as people work through it and unlock the data sets. You will get a notice, like if you try to edit a data set, when you can't, a little window pops up to let you know what's going on. And that window actually even tells you who has the lock. So if it's somebody that you know, you can kind of go yell at them and tell them to get on with it or whatever. Okay, so when you did the homework, for those of you who managed to get in there, you used the dataset manager to find a couple of different data sets. Now, right now, there's only about 100 different data sets loaded into the Marama EMF server, but obviously as time goes on, that can grow. So there are some options in the EMF for finding data sets of interest. So the first thing that you did was you used the Show Datasets of Type pull-down menu. So this is this menu at the top of the dataset manager where you just pick which dataset type you want, and then it'll filter the list, and you'll just see those datasets. There is an All option in that Show Datasets of Type menu, which will show you all datasets. So that can be useful if you just want to see everything. Again, not such a big deal when you have 100. Maybe when you have 1,000, then it starts to be a lot to scroll through. Another option for finding datasets is the Name Contains field. I'm going to hop back one second. So right here on the Dataset Manager, there's this Name Contains text field. And what that text field does is it basically lets you do a quick little search to find datasets whose name contains the string you type in. So for example, if you type in the string 2020, then you'll automatically see just the datasets whose name contains 2020. And you can use wildcards in this field, so you can use the asterisk character. So in this example here, you could type in PT asterisk 2020, and so then that's going to find you all the datasets whose name contains PT followed by 2020 at some point in the name. And this search is not case sensitive, so it'll find things uppercase, lowercase. Another option for finding datasets is the advanced dataset search. So on the Dataset Manager, there's an Advanced button, and when you click that button, you bring up the Advanced Dataset Search dialog, and as you would expect, this gives you a lot of options for finding datasets. And you can use them in combination with each other. So whatever criteria you put in, your data set will have to match all of those criteria. So it has things like name contains, which is just like the name contains quick search that we just talked about. But then it also has description contains. So here's a place where you can type in any keyword that the description might contain, any search term, and find data sets that way. Those are both case-insensitive searches. You also have options to find data sets by creator. The pull-down menu lets you pick different users, and then you can find which data sets those users have created. It has a data set type pull-down, just the same as the Dataset Manager itself, the main thing, but you can use that in combination with these other options. So you can find data sets of a particular type where the description contains a search term that you look for. We haven't talked about keywords yet. We'll get to those very shortly. But keywords are basically a way of adding even more metadata to the system. And so if your data sets have keywords, you can use the advanced search to find those data sets. We also haven't talked about QA stuff quite yet. We're going to do that in our upcoming webinar. But basically there, each QA step that you do has a name. So it might have a name like summarize by SCC or calculate average day emissions. You can use the advanced search to search by QA name. So if you want to find all your data sets where you ran a particular QA step on them, you want to find everything that has summarized by SCC, you can do that using the advanced search. There's also a pull-down menu to let you find things by project. Again, things in the Marama system are organized by project, so that can be a great way to find what you need. The used by case inputs, that relates to the case management stuff of the EMF, which is the functions for running modeling programs like Smoke, so we're not really going to talk about that. And then the data value filter is actually an interesting thing that lets you write little queries to find your data sets based on actual data values. So we were talking in the data viewer briefly about how you can use the row filter, and you could say something like SCC equals 22 whatever. You can actually use that same kind of syntax in the advanced search to find data sets by data values, which is kind of interesting. So as if it weren't enough to have, an advanced search, we do have a couple other ways of helping you with your data set management. In the homework, you learned how to apply filter criteria to the list of data sets. That data set manager uses the sort filter select table. That widget is part of the EMF. You'll see it all over the place. And so one of the options there is to build filter criteria that just filter the rows. So a really handy thing might be to build a filter criteria where you say, oh, the data set type contains the word inventory. And so then that will show you all your data sets where the data set type contains the word inventory. Or maybe you want to see everything where the data set type contains the word non-road. It's another option for being able to filter data sets to just what you're looking for. I do want to mention this filter criteria. Unlike the searching, this is actually case sensitive because it's literally matching based on the values that are shown in the table. So if in this example we have inventory with a capital I, if it was lowercase I, it wouldn't match anything because the data set types have they have inventory capitalized.
Catherine, we had a question here about wildcards. Is the star still a wildcard, and what wildcard functions are there? Wildcard?
Yeah. The star is the wildcard character, and basically it just means match any characters.
And does it mean any number of characters? So sometimes there used to be another wildcard $sign that would be one character.
No, this is any number of characters.
Okay, so the star is the only wildcard function that there is.
Right. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
And then one final thing I want to mention about data sets, there are a lot of data set types in the system, and you may only ever need a subset of those data set types. You may not be interested in all the other kinds of options. Maybe you only work with ORL data set types, for example. So you do have the option of setting up your user profile to only show you certain data set types. So we talked about this very briefly, but to get to your user profile, from the Manage menu, you select My Profile, and that'll bring up the user editor, the Edit User window. And so on the next slide here, I have a screenshot of an example of this. And basically, there's two boxes here that list your visible data set types and your hidden data set types. And so you can click on different data set types and move them to the hide box so that if you don't use these data set types, you can just hide them. And then they're not going to be showing up in the data set type pull-down menus. They're not going to show up in your list of data sets. So that can be a great way to just narrow down what you see if there's a bunch of stuff that you don't need to worry about. Okay, so now we have another little poll question.
I'll launch away. All right, so how can you find data sets by name? And here's a couple of possibilities. Go ahead and vote for those, the one that you think. Catherine?
Yeah, and this one's maybe kind of a gimme. When you see all of the above, it's probably that one. But we talked about how you can find data sets using the advanced data set search, the name contains field, or you can filter the rows. Now you might be asking, well, which one should I use? The name contains field on the dataset manager, that one is certainly the quickest to get to because you're in the dataset manager already. You can just enter a little search term, put in a wildcard character. If that's not sufficient, then the advanced dataset search will let you do more advanced searching. So if you need to do both a name contains and a description search, then the advanced search can do that. And then filtering the rows displayed in the dataset manager, that's another option. I'm not sure that you really use that a whole lot, but it is another option.
Okay, so back to your presentation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now I'm going back to the dataset properties viewer, and I just wanted to go through the other tabs that we have. So we talked about the summary tab and all of the different kinds of metadata that we have about the data set in terms of the geographic region and the description and who created it and whatnot. So we have these other tabs. The first one here is the data tab. And so the data tab is designed to provide you access to the raw data. And actually, as part of the homework, you went in here and you viewed the raw data for a data set. Now, the way that I mentioned that data sets have versions. And so a version is basically a bunch of revisions to the data. So as you make changes, you create a new version of the data set, and then you can make changes to it. When you first import a data set, the system automatically gives it version 0. So this is what we're seeing here is I have version 0. This is the initial version. Data sets can be marked as final, and once they're final, it means you can't make any more changes to them. So this is useful in data reproducibility. Basically, if you run a QA step, if you do an analysis or you do an export on a final version of the data set, you know that that data could not have been edited later because final versions can't be edited. Instead, what we would do is if we needed to make edits, we would need to create a new version of the data set. That version would not be marked as final. We'd be able to make our changes. And then once we were happy with all of our changes, we would mark that version as final. And I mentioned that there's this default version on data sets. So the default version just lets you pick which of my final versions should be considered default. So in a lot of cases, you'll see there's only one version. There's the initial version that was imported. That's it. We're not making any changes to it. But if you do have something where you make annual changes, for example, you do updates, then as each update is done, completed, you mark it as final, maybe update the default version of the data set because that is your new version that you're going to be using going forward. The next tab over is the Keywords tab, and I briefly mentioned that keywords are just a way to store additional metadata about data sets. These are actually kind of free form. There's a set of keywords that the EMF knows and does things with itself, but you could add more keywords to data sets. I think in general it's not used all that much, but it's another option. You will see keywords like this export suffix and export prefix. Basically, when you export the data, those suffixes and prefixes are going to get added on to the file name that gets created automatically. Also, those suffixes and prefixes get parsed when you import data. So if you import a file, those values will get stripped off the file name when it's figuring out the data set name to use. You'll also see things like indices. The raw data from the files gets imported into database tables in the EMF database. And so indices is a way to tell the EMF which columns of that data should get indexed. Again, this is something that's kind of a more advanced option that you probably won't have to worry about too much. And then just as a reminder, the advanced data set search can search based on these keywords. Again, in this example, it's nothing special. When we get into cost, the data sets that get automatically created by cost do have more keywords. So we'll probably come back to this topic then. So we talked about last time the problem of sort of how do we talk to other people about data sets? How do we share information? There is a notes option for each data set. Now, I'm a software developer, and I feel like I've developed various different kinds of management systems. And almost inevitably, one of the questions I get asked is, how can I make notes? Everybody wants to make notes about everything. And so the great thing is the EMF's got this notes facility built in. So you can make notes about data sets. Notes can be tagged as what they are, if they're a question, if they're an answer. The notes can also refer to other notes. So somebody can ask a question, and then when you answer it, you say, oh, I'm answering your question, and then the system keeps track of that. You also, when you create notes, they're tied to particular versions of the data set so that, we know which part of the data you're specifically asking about. And this create new note dialog, when you create a new note, this is the dialog that comes up. You're actually going to get to try this in the homework. So there's a question for you in the homework where I need an answer about a data set. So you'll all be creating your own little note to answer my question. And basically, this is just a straightforward dialogue where you're going to type in, the summary, what type it is, whether it's an answer or an observation. There's some other types in there too, I think. The details, and then this references lets you set what note you're referencing. So you'll get to try this out yourself. Okay, so we've talked about the summary, data, keywords, and note tabs. Next up is revisions. So I mentioned that data sets have versions, and when you make edits, you're editing a particular version, and those edits are saved as revisions. So a version will have a bunch of revisions, and this tab here will let you see all the revisions that have been made. Now, the EMF automatically creates these revisions as you're editing the raw data. You'll be making edits to the raw data, and then when you go to save it, it's going to ask you to type in information about what you changed and why you changed it. And so this is a way to review sort of who made these changes, when did they make the changes, and then all of those revisions feed into a version. And so once you're done with your revisions, then you mark your version as final. It's a little bit confusing with the words version versus revision, so I want to make sure that I always say it correctly. Now, the History tab here, this is designed to provide an access log to find out when data sets were exported. When we get to the export, it's just a couple minutes here, we're going to talk about exporting. You will mostly be exporting files straight to your desktop. You'll be using a download option. There's also all of this case management, which we've talked about before. And so this history is really designed to show you when data sets were exported for use in modeling runs. So you're not actually going to be seeing much going on with history, because when you do a local export, like you're mostly going to do, it's not going to create history records. So you're not really going to need to worry about this too much. These history records are also where the last accessed date comes from. We saw that on the Summary tab. So again, because you're not exporting these things for model runs, those features probably, you won't see those come up very much. Then this Sources tab shows us where the data associated with this data set actually came from, and also where it's stored currently. So it will tell us what file we originally imported the data from, and it also tells us what table in the database where we're storing the data. We talked very briefly about the fact that there is also a way to store data sets external to the EMF. This is where we don't import all the data into tables in the database. We just keep a pointer to a file on disk. In that case, the Sources tab will look just a little bit different, and it'll indicate where the file on disk is. And it has an option for you to update where the file on disk is. So if you needed to move files around, you could update the pointers to those files. And the last tab, which we'll only just touch on briefly today, because again, this will be the subject of the next webinar, is the QA tab. And so this shows a list of QA steps that have been created for the data set. And as we talked about very briefly, a QA step is these different kinds of actions we can take, like summarizing the data, creating a list of unique SCCs, computing different aspects of data, doing comparisons and whatnot. So this QA tab is where you will be working with these steps. You'll create steps, edit them, run them. Again, we're going to talk about this in detail in our next webinar. Okay, so just a couple of true or false questions. I'm not sure how you set these up, Julie, in the poll system. Okay, so the first one. You can't view a data set while someone else is editing it. That is false. What you can't do is you can't edit a data set while someone else is editing it. You will be able to view the data set. So you can view the properties, you can view the data, but you can't edit it. The next one, every data set in the EMF uses at least one table. Not technically. It's not technically true. There are these external data sets where the data is not imported into the database. So in these external sets, the data is not in the database, so you can't do the analysis and stuff on it because the data doesn't actually live in the database. And the third one, data set notes are associated with a particular version of a data set. That's true. When you create a note, you will indicate which version of the data set your note is referring to.
Okay, thanks. I'll go ahead and hide that, and it'll be back on your screen.
Okay. So this just briefly reviews the actions that you have available to you on the Dataset Manager. When you select different data sets, there are a couple of different actions available. One of the things to know about is the refresh action. Basically, what this will do is it'll contact the server for the latest data. So this can come up if other users are editing data and then you need to refresh your data just to see it. You will get, when you close windows and reopen them, the client will talk to the server at that point, but you can do things like edit some data and not close and reopen the Dataset Manager. So there's a case where you can just hit the refresh button and you'll get the latest data loaded in. There's also a save button to save the changes you've made to the data set. Export, which does the export, which we'll talk about in just a second, and then close. And if you have made unsaved changes, the system recognizes that you have changes, and so it will ask you if you want to save your changes or not, which is actually handy, because if you inadvertently made some changes, you were poking around and you accidentally changed something without meaning to, then you have an option to just discard your changes. Okay, so the last thing I want to cover is exporting data sets, and you'll get a chance to try this out in the homework. And so exporting a data set means taking the data from the database and writing it out to a file. So the format of that file is going to be determined by the data set type. So the data set type tells us if it should be an ORL file or a flat file or whatever file format it should have. And so that's what determines the format that the data will get written to. And so to get started on the export, you go to the Dataset Manager, select the data sets you want to export, and then you click the Export button. And on the next slide, I have a screenshot of the export options. So when you open this up, it will list the data sets that you want to export. You will pretty much always, in fact, always, you will be checking the box that says Download Files to Local Machine. By default, the way the export works, or actually the way the export works, is the file gets written out onto the server. So the data from the database gets written to the file on the server, and then you can optionally have that automatically get downloaded to your desktop. You don't have any access to files on the server, so you need to have the stuff downloaded to your desktop in order to actually be able to see it. You have some options to specify your own file name prefix. So depending on what you're doing, you may want to prefix the file just to get it a different name. You will get automatic prefixes and suffixes if they're defined by the keywords. So we talked about the export prefix and the export suffix keywords that a data set can have. So those will automatically get added to the name. And in the homework, you'll walk through an exercise where you figure out what the name of a data set is going to be. It's going to be based on the data set name. It also has those prefixes and suffixes. And then the EMF will automatically add things like the last modified date and the version. So you'll see how that all works in the homework. And as I mentioned, you'll pick which version you want. This is another case where the default version will be picked by default, but you'd be able to pick any version that was there. Then the last couple of boxes are some advanced filtering options. When you go to export a data set, you can choose to just export the entire data set. You want to see everything. Or you can use these filtering options to be able to limit all the rows that come out in the export. So row filter, this is the same syntax as what we talked about for viewing data sets, also in the advanced search. And there's an example of this in the homework. This is where you'd be able to type something in like FIPS starts with 37, so that you'd be able to just see the rows where the FIPS code starts with code 37, or pollutant equals VOC to just see the VOC records. The other options is, go ahead.
Can I just interrupt with a question? I'm sorry. So if you edit data, when does it become available for other users? When you exit out, or does it come up on the fly, during your session?
When you save your edits, so you have to explicitly click the Save button, and as soon as you do that, then the other users will see that. They may need to click refresh, but the version, anything that they do will always use the version that's on the server. So as soon as you save, so you don't have to quit the EMF, you don't have to log out, it's as soon as you save your changes.
Okay, thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no problem. Let's see, so these other options, we have filter data set and filter data set join condition. This is another advanced option where basically you can use a different data set and then write a join condition, which is like a SQL join condition, to indicate which rows of your data set you want exported. So you could do something like have a different data set that's a list of SCCs, and then you could join to that data set and be able to use the export and say, I only want to export the rows where the SCCs are in this other data set. So that could be useful if you're trying to compare different inventories and you only want to export the data that's common between both of them. You could say, okay, join to my non-point inventory. That's a terrible example because SCCs would not be common, but bear with me. Join to my other inventory and only export by FIPS code, say, that are in both inventories. Again, that's a fairly advanced option. You're going to walk through the row filter stuff, and the user's guide does give some examples of using the filter data set and filter data set joining. Then the last thing is purpose. That is only used for that history stuff, which is only for modeling runs. So you guys don't actually even need to type in a purpose. If you do type it, I don't think it'll even get saved. Let's see, this is just a recap of what I just talked about, which is you want to check the download file so that the files will be automatically downloaded to your computer. The file name will be generated from the dataset name plus prefixes plus modification date and the version. And then if you do have multiple versions, you need to pick which one you want to export. And then to actually do the export, once you set everything up, you click the export button to get started. And since this is a process where the server's going to do some work, you'll be using the status window. The status window will be updated, and it'll show you when the export is completed. And then the download starts onto your computer. So you'll have this download window, and the download window has a little progress bar to show you how it's going. And so once that's done, then you can basically right-click on the download, and there'll be an option that says Open Containing Folder, and basically that'll then open the file up in Windows Explorer. And you will definitely be trying this out in the homework because you're going to export a data set, and then you're going to try out the row filtering to export just part of the data set. So just to recap, we went over a lot of stuff today, but we went through the various properties of data sets. We talked about sort of how the data gets described, where the data gets stored, being able to do notes, versions of data. Then we talked about how do we find data sets. We talked about the advanced data set search, also some filtering options. And then finally, we went over exporting options, how you can export data sets or portions of data sets and download those files to your computer. And so you're going to get to try all of that out in the homework. So Julie, should I show the homework now, or should we see if there are any other questions?
Well, I guess that is a good idea to invite questions at this point. So are there any folks who have questions that you want to bring up right now? Either hit the raising hand button or type them in. And maybe, Catherine, if you could just get started on the overview of the homework, and then if people have questions, they can go ahead and put stuff in. Here's a question here. Could you describe or provide a written write-up on the two locking methods that you had there? And maybe is that described in the user's guide that maybe we could send a link for?
Yeah, we briefly mention it. I mean, there's not much there. It's basically when you go in and you're looking at a data set, you have the options to view a data set, edit the properties, or edit the data. So if you click either of those edit buttons, you basically have locked the data set for editing either the properties or the data. And so then when you close that window, you close the edit properties window or close the edit data, the lock is automatically removed and other people can work with it. So that's basically all there is to it. You do see if you try to edit something that somebody else has, you will get a little pop-up that tells you who is editing it and when they started editing it to hopefully give you an idea of when they might be done with it. I don't know if there's any kind of automatic, like if somebody's been idle for a really long time, if it automatically kicks them out. I did see when you're editing data, it shows you your own lock information, and it says that it'll automatically expire. I'm not sure, and that was a fairly long time. It's like 3 hours or something, I think. So I'm not sure if there's anything like that for editing properties. So in general, when you're doing your stuff, just be considerate of other people, and again, stick to viewing if you can. Otherwise, if you are doing edits, just make sure to kind of clean up after yourself. Quit the EMF client when you're done, because that'll clean everything up as well.
Okay, and let's see. Is this Chris Trussell? Had a question. Or maybe it's David Trussell. I unmuted you. Okay, well, for some reason I think your mic is not working. If you want to type in the question that you had, that'd be great. And then Joseph Chikuta had a question about messaging users through the system. Like, let's say they are editing, and can you export? That's the first question. So maybe you could answer that one, and then I'll ask the second one. Can you message users through the system?
Oh, no, I haven't seen anything like that. There is a way you can get a list of all the users, and you can see who else is logged on at the same time as you, and that also shows you their email addresses and phone numbers. Now, we don't particularly have a privacy policy, so, you know, I wouldn't just be considerate of other people, basically. You know, there's probably going to be a little learning process here of figuring out how things are going to work as folks work on things together. But yes, there's not anything to sort of send a text message or anything to somebody else. You can obviously ask notes about data sets, but that's not probably the same thing.
Right, okay. So they'd have to use their regular email to do that.
Yeah.
And so then the next question is, can you export as other formats? Like, if it's ORL, can you export to FF10?
There are possibly some options of being able to run a QA step that converts the data to a different format. I can definitely check if any of that is built in or if that would be special. Now, we'll get into QA steps, and basically one really powerful thing is just the ability to run whatever SQL commands you want. So you could do something where you take your ORL data and construct a SQL query that then runs, and then you have a report. But no, in terms of saying, oh, take this data set and convert it to a different format, I haven't seen anything like that. I'll definitely check if there are some QA programs that can do that, and we can talk about that next time.
Okay, great. And then let's see. Is there more detail somewhere about finalizing data so no more edits are allowed? Is a new version created when a previously finalized version is finalized?
The way a version gets finalized is actually really simple, because let me see if I can pull up something here. See if I still have my dataset properties view. That's just a view. Here's a case where I wanted to show you one of the editing options, but I'm only just viewing the thing. So if I go edit, it'll take just a second. You may notice this as you're doing stuff. Things just take a little time because it has to go out to the server to pull the data back. It's going over the internet and everything. Basically, there's a button that you click that says mark as final, and that's it. That's the extent of marking something as final.
So once you click that button, then the next,
you're done.
Right, and if a change is made, it would be the next version, right?
Right. If you want to start making changes to another version, you end up copying the version, copy a final version that becomes considered your base version, and then you start making edits on that. And I'm going to talk a little bit in the next webinar, I think, about a little bit more of the data editing, if that seems of interest. I wasn't sure how much we wanted to cover that, but I can talk a little bit more about that if that seems useful.
Okay. All right, and then there was a question about the CAMD data and ERTAC, and let's see, are hourly CAMD data used by ERTAC available data sets at this time? And the answer to that will be no. So one of the compromises that we are going to have to do in order to get the data in here will be to summarize our ERTAC data up to the daily basis rather than hourly, because otherwise it's just too large a data set. So there will be EGU data in here. It will be ERTAC EGU data, but it will be summarized to the up to the day. Okay, I don't know if you had anything to add on that, Catherine.
No, I mean, that's the kind of thing where if we want to, we can always take a subset and try the hourly, but yeah, the suspicion is it would just be too much data to work with.
Right. They're pretty large data sets.
Right.
So something that we actually struggle with in ERTAC. So any comments from either Susan or Catherine or VH?
No, thanks, Julie.
Okay, great. All right, then we'll see you on the next one. Thanks very much, folks. Bye-bye now.